To discuss the decolonization of medical education, research, and practice, we now welcome Professor Faadiel Essop, Director of the Center for Cardiometabolic Research in Africa, please. A Fellow of the American Physiological Society, and recently elected Fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa. He has led major professional societies in physiology and received the Lifetime Career Achievement Award for Research Excellence. With that, I hand it over to Professor Essop.
Thank you to the chairperson, and good afternoon to everybody. I know I'm standing between you and tea time, but I hope to give you some food for thought that we can discuss over tea. Shh, shh. So today I'm going to focus a little bit. I'm a physiologist and also a bit of a philosopher, to speak about the decolonization of medical education in particular, with some consideration to indigenous knowledge systems. So the successes of modern medicine. I'm not here to bash modern medicine, I'm part of it. Life expectancy has increased substantially, as shown. This is in the UK data, over the last 170 years. Males and females indicated in green and in purple, and of course this can vary per region in the world. My field is looking at chronic stress and heart disease, and we can see the interventions shown on the screen there for deaths per 100,000 over the last few decades. So there are some success stories, but however, there are also additional problems associated with modern medicine, as we've heard previously with some of the speakers highlighting this, the rise of non-communicable diseases for one, mental health complications and so forth. But I also want to draw you to other issues. So this paper was published about 10 years ago, PNAS, looking at residents and medical students' attitudes, looking at pain in black patients and white patients. And then more than half of them stated that black people feel less pain. So where does that come from? This is my question I'm asking. So this we can trace back as part of the colonial project. So it's deeply embedded in the system, and this is a mere 10 years ago. 5 years ago, we had this paper that was published in non-white South African women. And the conclusion was, it subsequently retracted, that these non-white women suffered from impaired cognition. So it went through the publication, peer review process, published, there was an outcry, and it had to be retracted. So these are some of the issues. Where does it come from? The underbelly of modern medicine. We have to consider some of the philosophical roots, therefore, of modern medicine. One is the notion of separatedness, that we separate ourselves from nature. Okay, so observer from observed, parts from the whole, organism from the environment, human from nature, mind from matter, science from spiritual beliefs. So if we have this attitude, we see nature as something distinct that we can have certain effects on. So Francis Bacon, one of the founders of the scientific method, stated that nature will reveal its secrets under torture. It shows the type of mindset. The triumph of reductionism. I'm in that field, so everything we have to reduce down to molecules, to genes, proteins, and we in essence just a bag of molecules. So we take out values, morality, consciousness. It's all got to be reduced to biological, otherwise it's not true. And the value of human life to functionality. We operate within a materialist Darwinian framework. So there's a sense of purposelessness in what we do, okay? We only shape by our imperative to adapt, to reproduce. So a type of nihilistic behavior. And so if we look at mental issues, we can see perhaps deep down where that could stem from. The notion of scientism, that is that the scientific method is inherently superior to any other way of knowing. So indigenous knowledges is, even if it's rational, does not have a place at this table, because this is the only way to understand reality. If it doesn't meet these criteria, it's not accepted. And then mathematical realism, that science would try and reduce truth and reality to mathematics, to an equation. But we know from the non-Western traditions this is not the case. Complexity. You cannot. Can you reduce yoga to a mathematical formula? If you cannot, it's not true. So, in addition, how does modern medicine view the other, the colonized populations? Okay, so one of this, which is focused on the blue parts, is that this is for Africa. This is from Carl Pearson, the father of biostatistics, the Pearson correlation, the chi-square test, that in Africa has not yet produced a civilization comparable with the Aryan. Educate and nurture them as you will, you'll not succeed in modifying the stock. So this is a top person in the history of modern medicine. Likewise, others have commented on primitive cultures. Again, the other. And let's focus on the blue. What those cultures are doing, there's no theoretical basis. It's magic and irrational. So all the Ayurveda we're talking about for thousands of years, the Chinese, Islamic medicine, Africa, South America, can be reduced to those terminologies. So we understand the deep-seated roots of why we're sitting where we are today. And then Richard Dawkins, who wrote this book, The Selfish Gene, that we are basically just carriers of the genes control us. They made us, okay? So they're the replicators, they're using us to perpetuate themselves. So we basically, he puts it there, this is a quote, we survival machines. So again, human beings, machines, where does it leave all our biographical information that relates to us being human, the essence? Okay? So there's several structural flaws I've pointed out in modern medicine. Okay? The concept of race, racial essentialism, it doesn't exist, but it features. Separation of knowledge and values. Instrumental rationality, that it's focused on efficiency and utility at the end of the day, above values, justice, culture, all of those things dismissed. And then the third world problems, who decides on that? The funders, ultimately. What will be deemed as a problem for the so-called third world? If it's overpopulation, sterilize them, or population control, versus maybe it's a poverty issue. So all of that, modern medicine played a key role then in the subjugation of the non-West as well. It was co-opted in that setting. So colonization, obviously, is the physical occupation of lands by the colonists, but most importantly, also taking the knowledge systems, educational systems, and actively suppressing that. So if it was in India, to delegitimize Ayurveda, defund it, and replace it now with modern Western colleges, you see. Likewise, other traditions that they're actively suppressed or even outlawed in some of the countries. So, but they've left, you may say. We're all free. Not really. Okay? There's the phenomenon of coloniality, which refers to those long-standing patterns post, once they've left, but the structures are in place. So even though in India it's now, you've got your programs, does it actually translate? You said that the traditional medical doctors still seen as a higher value because coloniality will survive colonialism. This was published 5 years ago. It just shows you, I want to demonstrate how these effects remain. Slavery right at the top. Then you get the laws freeing people, but ultimately it doesn't, the structural imperatives are still in place. So that disease burden in dark-skinned people remain relatively high. So you've got to see it in its context. Okay. Oops, yeah, I've now switched it off. And likewise, these are just 2 books published within the last decade. White people are smarter than black people, in essence, higher IQ. And it's to do with the genes, obviously, which is not true. but you can understand where it comes from. So we need to decolonize this. This is my message today. And decolonization requires an understanding of the history of medical knowledge. As I've shown you, some of the foundations which are flawed. And then once we understand that, we can begin to reconstruct. Okay? Not replace, reconstruct, inclusive attitudes and practices, so we have equitable provision of health care. And we have to look at local and indigenous wisdom as well in this equation. Because and focusing on education, which is what I'm going to talk about, it's dominated still by the Western biomedical model. Okay? And that's insensitive to experiences of most people of the world and denial of the majority of the world's epistemologies. So therefore, we're battling to create this space within these particular institutions. Okay. And so I try to look at higher education and see how can we begin to decolonize this. Okay, so I was attracted for the definition of a university is to make humanity, so to speak. So we want to have graduates that's human beings in the fullest sense, that they will work across disciplines, and we want to deliver fully developed human beings, ultimately. Okay? And so I wrote a chapter on this phenomenon of scientific or medical elitism that we have in science and medicine, the perception that it's a value-free enterprise. There's no context. Believe us, we're dealing with the facts. It's not true, as I've shown you some of the context. There's a strong emphasis on biological versus humane aspects, alienation from other disciplines, and an inflated belief in superiority in the medical fraternity, as pointed out already. Okay? So, and these are some of the issues our people are facing, our students, that we have to deal with today. How do we bring this into the curriculum in medicine? Okay? These are all surrounding us. So I spoke to the university, can I begin to address this within the current system? They said you could start at the graduate level. If it works, then we can filter it into the medical students program. Okay? So I started by looking at a module I developed for the graduate students. I call it the features of science, to address some of these issues. And I rooted this in for them to have critical thinking, self-reflection, empathy, holistic views of the world. Okay? And then also to have this cultivation of humanity by Nathan Nussbaum. So this was the sort of philosophical framework within which I approached this. And these are some of the topics we've discussed. You can see sessions 9, 10, 11, 12. We looked at racism, decolonization, and indigenous knowledge. I could now expose them. I couldn't do Ayurveda, but I can expose them to the principles, at least, of all the different knowledge systems, and that there is a space for all of this, and also science communication. These were just some images of the class and the assignments, reflective journals, open essays, group videos. And part of the curriculum focused on the role of colonialism and racial essentialism. So that the idea of different races coming from Carl Linnaeus, that there's 4 subspecies of human beings based on skin color and physical traits. And then philosophers picking up on this, Immanuel Kant, that there's a hierarchy of races. White at the top, degeneration from that ideal to the rest, below that, you see. And the ideal race coming from Caucasus, a place, modern-day Georgia, because they had the perfect skull, and anybody else from that is inferior. Okay. So it's deep-seated. We're talking about 1600s, 1700s. The journals, this is the forerunner of the New England Journal of Medicine. This spawned a whole idea to look at differences, skull sizes, intellect, etc. This is in the New England Journal of Medicine. One of the doctors wrote that the notion of equality is utopian. It doesn't exist. It's unscientific, unscriptural. Charles Darwin also added to this. The civilized races of man will most certainly exterminate and replace those throughout the world, the savage races. And then eugenics came about. Can we outbreed this? The bad traits of those with skins, colored skin, so to speak. And so this was pervasive long before Hitler. We're talking about decades. There were conferences on eugenics that people attended. Kellogg started the Race Betterment Foundation in the US, for example. And this is just one example. So all of these topics we discussed in the module. This is what I'm trying to show you. Feeble-minded people cannot be parents, good parents. So it stems from this idea. So in the US, there was forced sterilization of feeble-minded people, mostly black women. Tens of thousands were denied the opportunity to fall pregnant, up till the late 1970s, very recently. This is a practical example of such type of biology. Serum creatinine levels, the same in black patient, white patient. There's an algorithm. Chronic kidney disease stage, in the black person is stage 1, but in the white person, stage 2. So you're not going to get the appropriate treatment because of a corrective algorithm. And so people could calculate that if those individuals did receive, if that correction wasn't made, 3 more million black Americans would have had a more stringent chronic kidney disease evaluation. And they would have gone for transplantations and better treatments. And so, of course, we discussed the Human Genome Project, which have shown that there is no difference in people in terms of their biology. Race is just a socio-political construct. It doesn't exist. So the students are alerted to the flaws in modern medicine, that we move away from race-based medicine to a race-conscious medicine that remains in terms of structural legacies. It's not because people are black, but because the neighborhood, the environment, shapes people, which is closer to indigenous knowledge, if you think about it. I also brought in some transdisciplinarity by bringing in art students into these classes, where I talked to them about heart physiology and pathophysiology, and they captured this in terms of artworks. And I brought the medical students to chat with them over their artworks. Again, the idea would be to open the minds, empathy, humanity. Remember, this is what we want to inculcate, and to see that there's other ways of knowing. Okay? So these are some of the artworks and the medical students' responses. Science often focuses on the detail, but this experience taught us to think of the whole and the bigger concept. Doesn't that ring a bell? And to include humane aspects. We need to expand our viewpoints when focusing on the design of treatments and therapies. Okay? And although there are distinct sort of areas, science and medicine and art, there's some overlap, one student wrote, and there's interconnectivity between those disciplines. And that scientists should sometimes take a step back from the detail to look for bigger creative thinking and abilities to lead to innovation and discoveries. So those were just some engagements between the art students and the graduate students, actually in classes and discussing these topics. So almost done, last slide or two. So I wanted to show you an example of a curriculum remodeling process that's now taken for the last 3-4 years. I've done this. So the next step for me now, having proven this in a smaller group, and I've applied for this, is to take it into the formal medical curriculum, which is already a packed curriculum, obviously. But I will bring in some of those principles into the curriculum at the second-year level, so that if we can expose the students at that level, then by the time they graduate, they'll be perhaps more open to this type of ideas that we're hearing here today. So, and part of this would begin then with a critical awareness of the historical influences of colonization, okay, on knowledge systems, medical practice and research. I'm just at the start of this process, so I'm looking for interested people to contact me. So we need to develop now next explicit frameworks. How do we do this? So that we look at addressing the historical injustices in medical education. We've got to look at mentorship programs for those who've been marginalized because of structural racism. And then we've got to incorporate multiple knowledge systems into this process. Indigenous communities should be engaged as co-creators of the curriculum and as co-educators. So we bring in Dr. Baswati to come and teach, you see, the principles. But it must not just be tokenism also. We must be careful that you come in for a session and we tick that box. Then we don't really fundamentally change it, and it leads to a transformative change. So we need to embed this Indigenous knowledge systems into the curriculum across the medical training, whether it's going to be in first year and second year. So through case studies or through engagement with healers like yourselves, that they just open up their minds then ultimately when they graduate, that modern Western medicine is not the only way of knowing. And we look at, as I've mentioned, scientism as an example. So I'm busy with this book, Decolonizing Medical Education, Research and Practice, which is going to be published early in 2026, which covers all of these aspects, both the problems I've highlighted, the colonization, but also the decolonization, which would include Indigenous knowledge systems. And I'm waiting for a chapter still from my colleague to submit something on Ayurvedic medicine. And we've got African knowledge systems, different knowledge systems. And then how do we integrate that into our education, our curricula, research, and in terms of clinical practice? Thank you very much for your time.